have no voice. We will try. The sheep analogy was not just for the kids today. The sheep analogy is really for all of us. And as I looked at the lectionary today, I really should have had us read Isaiah 2, 1 through 5, in addition to Matthew 24. I am not going to preach about the rapture. Aren't you glad? Matthew 24, verses 36 to 44 is what is the text, rather, that we get when we, or the text that is used to talk about the rapture. You've all heard about what people call the rapture, right? That Jesus is coming, and one day, as the text says, one will be in the field, and one will be taken, and the other will be gone. You'll look around, and somebody will be standing beside you, and they might be gone. Have any of you read the Left Behind series of books when they came out years ago? I read them because I had a coworker at the time who was reading them. They were out, the early 2000s, I think. It's been 15 years or so at least. And this young man was Jewish. And I decided that I would read it because he knew I was in divinity school at the time. We both worked at Ameritech. And he actually reported to me and he said, "Have you read these books?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He said, it's a good story. So I started to read the books, and whatever you think about any theology of rapture or second coming or the end of the world, these books are good stories. They're actually entertaining stories. This gave me a real opportunity to talk to this young man over a period of months as he and I both read the books. And every time another book came out, I would read the book, he would read the book. We'd even have lunch sometimes, get food and sit at our desk. He'd come into my office and we'd sit and chat about these books. I'm pretty dedicated to evangelism, right? Actually, I wasn't so dedicated to evangelism. I actually really enjoyed reading the books. Even though we may have a problem with this notion of when Jesus will return, what we have to remember is the reason that we even think about the return of Christ is because it is at the very source of our hope for this world. Today is the first Sunday of Advent, and we have lit the candle of hope. The prophet Isaiah was one of the chief prophets trying to provide comfort to a wounded and conquered people, Israel. Over many years, it's the words of Isaiah who remind us of what this deliverer, this conqueror is going to be. And because he's described in such human terms, he's described in powerful terms, he's described in sometimes very contradictory terms. The beginning of Isaiah in Isaiah 2, he's described as someone who will help us to walk in God's paths. And in the next few verses, we hear those familiar words about beating our plowshares into wheat and our pruning hook, our swords into pruning hooks. In other words, taking the weapons of war and beating them into peaceful instruments that we can use for unity and peace. These words were in the Hebrew text, not just for generations, but for thousands and thousands of years. Isaiah was spoken of, or speaks of the Messiah as a suffering servant, as someone who will love, who will weep over Jerusalem. The history of Israel had been filled with such devastation, with both promises and disappointment. Israel had been a great nation. Israel had been the throne of the King David. Jerusalem had been called the city of David. We are studying a lot about Jerusalem in Sunday school. You should come and hear what we're learning. For generations, Isaiah understood that because these people were displaced and no longer in control of their own destiny, what they needed to know was that God would yet do a new thing. The whole book of Isaiah is dedicated to restoring the hope of the nation of Israel. In the first half of the book of Isaiah, we hear all of these wonderful things that are written in that wonderful piece by Handel, Messiah. He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. We hear that he will be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God. We hear, for unto us a son is born, unto us a child is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. By the time we get to the second half of Isaiah, Isaiah has lived through yet another conquest, and he's now telling them, God's going to do a new thing. Just you wait. God's going to do a new thing. And even though it doesn't feel like it, even though it doesn't seem like it, even though there's no obvious evidence of victory for us right now, God has always promised to deliver us. And this God is faithful. He will not leave you. The God of Israel who does not slumber or sleep in the midst of displacement and war. Isaiah keeps trying to find the right way, a more powerful way to give his people hope. Nothing is more important to the people of Israel than their relationship with God. Nothing is more important than being in what they would call right standing, or being in a place of righteousness. And so long before there was even the temple in Jerusalem, they would offer sacrificial offerings on their own little stone altars. Once the temple was built by Solomon, a whole cult developed around what one was supposed to do. There are laws in Deuteronomy and Leviticus about what kinds of offering one needs to offer for sin X and Y. People traveled once they were displaced from all around the world to get back to Jerusalem in order to be able to offer those offerings of sacrifice in that special place, in the temple. Those bighorn rams are well known. Those bighorn sheep are well known to people like the shepherd David, who wrote many of our Psalms. And if you read through the Psalms, you will hear a lot of talk about staying on the path, about rocky hills, about clefts in the rock. David had observed these particular sheep whose hooves are cleft and split so that they can grasp the rock, so that they can carry this heavy weight of 30 pounds in addition to their heads up and down, up and down. Sort of a metaphor for generations of Israelites who knew that they had to obey the law of God. Up and down, over and over, over and over. And yet with each passing year it got harder because the deliverer had not yet appeared. There might be another conquest. They were displaced yet again, it seemed, at least once in every generation. It never seemed like it was getting easier. To believe that there would be a deliverer was getting harder. When will he come? How long must we wait, and how will we function until he comes? The sheep understood that by teaching one another this well-worn path, they weren't necessarily discouraging innovation. What they were doing is ensuring survival. That no matter what happened, they must always be in right relationship to God. They must always keep the law of God, even though that was really hard to do. They give us a wonderful lesson of what it means to obey every jot and tittle and still not have our hearts right. How many of you keep the 10 Commandments faithfully? If your entrance into this place were dependent upon whether or not you had been a perfect person yesterday. What if you had to offer some sort of offering before you came into the sanctuary? It might take us a while to get in here, mightn't it? Because we'd all have to do something to make amends for something that we had done. The weight of those horns is really another metaphor for the weight of oppression on the people of Israel. And yet they were being told that this deliverer was going to make it easier for them to go up and down, to stay on that path, to follow God's ways. And yet in other places in Isaiah, we're told he's going to be be like this suffering servant, that's not really what's going to help me put food on my table or fight off these invading hordes of conquest. And yet, generations, they repeated the promise to their children. And when deliverance finally came, God continued to give rituals. The children of Israel were rescued, as it were, from Egypt. We know this story. Finally, the deliverer came after generations, hundreds of years being working, making bricks without straw, working under the lash of hard slave drivers. And when deliverance came, there was a ritual that was put in place. A lamb whose blood, once offered in sacrifice, was now to be painted over the door. A dinner of unleavened bread and bitter herbs, all to remind them of the blood of protection, the hasty departure from Egypt, no time for the bread to rise, and the bitter herbs which represented years of bondage and toil. And yet even today, the Jewish people remember that escape. They have that ritual. And years later, our deliverer, Jesus Christ, took that same meal and reminded us that it was his body broken for us and his blood shed for us. The promise that was made to David was that Israel would always be run or have a king from his line of descendants. And so Isaiah continues to speak that promise that the house of David would be the place from which the deliverer came. This passage also reminds us not only that the deliverer would help us to walk those paths generation after generation, uphill and down, season in and season out, but that the deliverer would bring peace. The angels that sang on the night of Jesus' birth promised peace on earth, goodwill toward men. And yet there was no shining magic wand that covered the earth to put an end to all war. But there was a shining sense of hope that night. Just as the Jewish people lived for hope for generations, that they would return to their holy city, that they would have a conqueror, that they would have a deliverer. We are somehow waiting, although we don't know when, we don't even really know why, only that Jesus told us that he would return. The familiar words of Isaiah 2 and 4 says, "He shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." That day has not come. Jesus came, and that day has not come. And so yet, like the people of Israel, and like those earliest Christians who thought Jesus would return momentarily, the whole letter to the Thessalonians is written to remind those early Christians that even though some of them would die, as they saw their friends dying around them and Jesus had not yet returned, that there was yet hope. Isaiah 2 and 5 says, "O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." We have lived with these words of hope for generations and generations. And even though we have not seen this day, Jesus has said that he will return. He reminds us to be vigilant, to be prepared, to have him find us working for this day, to have him find us not asleep, not at each other's throats, not fallen into depression or cynicism, but lifting up these words, "Neither shall they learn war anymore." O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. It's a hard thing to be a Christian sometimes. hard to wait for the reign of God. It's hard to wait for peace on earth, goodwill toward men. And yet what we have to keep us walking those paths in season and out of season, up and down, just as generations before have done, is the hope of Jesus' love. It's the hope that what we can do now until he returns will somehow make a difference. It's the hope that when he comes, he will not find us lazy. He may find us weary, but hopefully he will find us at work. Hopefully he will find us loving and respecting and honoring this walk that we must take in the light of the Lord. When Jesus dies and is resurrected and ascends, that sense of hope is overshadowed by a sense of panic by those early Christians, because the one who has been among them is now gone. How will they go on? We've never known that physical presence of the man Jesus. All we have is the Spirit that God gives us, that is part of what many of us believe to be that triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And yet we have his word, which reminds us of great love, of joy, of hope. And in this Advent season, as war and famine and hunger and destruction and disrespect and volatility are all around us, Jesus reminds us to be vigilant, that we might be found working for his kingdom. Isaiah reminds us that one day nations will not learn war anymore. And Jesus would remind us that in his word, he has taught us to hope, to remember that we are the children of the living God, and that it is necessary to always walk in the path of the Lord, even though the load may be heavy, the hills might be rocky. There are no formulas that will tell us when Jesus returns, but his word reminds us that in his love we carry on, we shed hope, we spread love, we work for peace. Let us be vigilant in these difficult times and hope and pray until the Lord himself shall come. Amen.